In 1755 in the Pennsylvania wilderness, George Washington is resting in a carriage when he's suddenly awakened by an explosion. He rushes out and finds himself in the middle of a chaotic camp, with people firing at the enemy or tending the wounded all over the place. As things keep exploding around him, George grabs a gun and learns that his camp has been ambushed. When he sees an enemy soldier, he immediately shoots him down while feeling like his head is about to explode. He gathers his strength and gets on a horse to ride over the hill, where he finds the battlefield. George wants to fight, but Gage tells him that the general has already ordered a full retreat and his team is at the front lines. Yet George thinks it's worth the risk. 12 years earlier in Virginia, a younger George attends his father's funeral. Here he meets his half-brother Lawrence, who used to be a captain in the Majesty's Navy. Lawrence gives George a compass that belonged to their father and explains that he's been appointed general of the Virginia militia, so he has to gather volunteers. George has heard that Washington men die young and thinks the name is cursed. He's also frustrated because his mother won't send him back to school. Instead, he has to start farming to support the family. When George says it's not what he wants, Lawrence reminds him that it's what duty demands. George ignores Lawrence and begins walking to school, even though it's 2 miles away. Moments later, George is back at home, angrily chopping a tree. When his mother Mary tries to calm him down, George yells at her because the school turned him down at her request. He says he has nothing, so Mary scolds him and reminds him they have a whole farm, slaves to feed, and an empty purse to fill. As the eldest son, this is his duty. In the afternoon, Lawrence finds George crying in front of the fireplace. He decides to give him a book about decent behavior so he can learn to be a proper gentleman. Lawrence also lends him some books he considers essential reading, promising to educate George to make up for the lack of school. The brothers start spending a lot of time together, so George learns land surveying, sword fighting, chess, horse riding, and how to deal with the aristocracy. In 1753, George tries to apply to be a soldier in the British Army after sending letters for months. However, he's turned down because he can't pay for the ensign. He owns no land, and he has no formal education. He's told to stop sending letters and join the militia instead. In the evening, George tries to attend an important party at the Belvoir estate, but he isn't allowed to because he has no invitation. While everyone is distracted, George sneaks around the back and goes to the service door, where the servants tell him how to get into the house. When George reaches the main area, he's seen by Sally, a relative of the estate owner. At first she scolds him, but she ends up admitting she doesn't feel like she belongs either and is charmed by his compliments. However, she turns him down when he asks her to dance. Afterward, George mingles in the crowd and impresses Major Gage with his knowledge of the war, but he's humiliated by William, who mocks his status. Then George sees someone rushing upstairs and follows him to the library. This man is Thomas, the owner of this estate. George charms him by discussing literature and even gets him to lend him a book. By the time George volunteers to survey and map the Ohio Territory, Thomas likes him so much that he agrees to hire him. Later in a pub, George meets with his old friend Christopher, who is also a surveyor. George asks him to join him on the Ohio mission and Christopher gladly agrees, so they drink to celebrate. Christopher and George begin traveling together through Ohio and get to admire incredibly beautiful views. George often writes to Sally telling her all about the amazing things he sees. Sally likes the letters, but Christopher thinks George is fighting a lost battle because she's above his station. 3 months later, the duo is almost freezing because of the heavy snow and wonders if they should head back since their horses are on the verge of death. Suddenly they're surrounded by members of the Mingo tribe, including their leader Tenackerson. He accuses them of trying to steal the land, so George assures him they're just surveyors and shows him his work. Then Tenackerson takes them further into the woods to reveal that the French has set up a fort in the area. Afterward, George and Christopher decide to take a raft across the river since it's the fastest way to get home. When they see a cascade ahead of them, they desperately try to row back to the shore, but the current is too strong and soon throws them into the freezing water. After some struggle, the duo manages to swim back to land, only to discover they're stuck on a small island in the middle of the river. Hours pass and the men stay close to provide each other with body warmth. Their only escape would be swimming across the river, but they don't have the strength to go that far without the temperature killing them. Luckily, the river ends up freezing, and they can simply walk on it. Sometime later, George is telling Lawrence about the French fort. Lawrence keeps coughing and George discovers that he has tuberculosis, so he'll die soon. Since Lawrence can't travel in this condition, it's up to George to deliver the news. The next day, George meets with Lieutenant Governor Robert to tell him about the French fort. Robert wants Lawrence to lead an expedition that will tell the French to leave, so George explains that his brother is sick and he wants to be his replacement, even presenting Lawrence's recommendation letter. Robert agrees and makes George major of the militia. When George asks if they'll be paid the same as the British officers of the Crown, Robert finds the question offensive. George decides he'll volunteer his service because he doesn't need pay that isn't equal to those of whom he'll prove himself equal. Before leading on his mission, George visits Sally, who reads his notes from the expedition and is impressed by how poetic they are. Sally admits she's afraid of making the wrong choices and reminds him that she has a duty to fulfill, yet she kisses him anyway. The next day, George leaves with the militia formed by Christopher, outlaws, debtors, slaves, and a few patriots. When they stop to camp for the night, the horse of their scout comes back alone. Soon the camp is surrounded by Tenackerson and his men, who have captured Scout Tucker. George assures them that they don't want trouble, they're only looking to kick the French out. Tenackerson hates the French because they killed his father, so he agrees to guide the militia to the fort. The next morning they deliver the message to Officer Joseph, who laughs in George's face but still invites the group to dinner. After eating, Joseph points out that the British sent George with the message so when it fails they have someone to blame. He swears the French will never leave and George responds they'll force them to, but Joseph isn't afraid of a war and kicks the militia out. Afterward George tells his team to rest while he rides ahead. When Robert hears the news, he asks George to transcribe all the information he has so it can be presented to the council in the morning. George asks for a night's rest first but he's denied. While George works, Lawrence looks at his notes and calls them a dangerous escalation. He wonders why proper soldiers aren't doing this and just like Joseph, he concludes that the British are using his brother. If the mission is successful they'll claim the glory, if it fails they'll blame the colonials. An argument ensues because George refuses to stay home doing nothing, and leaves in a huff when he realizes that his brother doesn't believe in him. The next day George visits Sally at a party and finally convinces her to dance with him. They're interrupted by William, who once again tries to humiliate him in front of a crowd and volunteers to lend him 2 sleighs as if it was a huge favor. Talmash cuts the tension by congratulating George on his rank and reveals that William and Sally are engaged. George swallows his feelings and wishes them the best before leaving. When George arrives at the militia camp, he reads the council's decision. They must act on the defensive, but if the French try anything, offenders must be killed. The militia isn't happy about this because it's a clear declaration of war, yet they weren't sent proper soldiers. Some men want to leave since they were hired to deliver a letter not to fight, but George explains it would get them flogged as deserters. 2 men almost get aggressive so George yells at them, reminding them that they took an oath so this is their duty. At that moment Tucker arrives with important news. The French have a new camp 5 miles from there. Tenackerson concludes they're looking for land to build another fort, so George agrees to take the group on a simple reconnaissance mission. Once they're close enough to the French camp, someone in the shadows opens fire, killing an enemy officer. George still wants his men to hold their ground, but the French open fire so the militia fires back. The natives run ahead to fight hand to hand, which the French don't expect. George sees this as an opportunity and orders his men to advance too. Soon both sides are losing soldiers by the second, and Joseph gets shot in the leg. George tries to tell his men to take prisoners instead of killing them but he's ignored. When a French soldier is about to shoot him, George has no choice but to kill him first. Another Frenchman then knocks him down and almost kills him, however Christopher brings the guy down first. Meanwhile Tenackerson and his men captured Joseph and kill him by repeatedly hitting him with an axe. Afterward the militia takes over the French camp and starts building their own fort. In his report letter, George explains he doesn't know who fired the first shot and fears that the war is imminent. He also asks the British to send them reinforcements. Some men point out that this location will make the fort an easy target when the area floods, but George doesn't know what else to do. Eventually a group of British soldiers led by Captain James arrive at the fort. He explains they're here as reinforcements because Joseph's brother is approaching with an army seeking revenge. A statement from Robert promotes George to colonel, but James and his men refuse to follow his orders. In the evening it starts to rain, so the militia desperately starts digging a ditch. Tenackerson has asked other tribes for help but some refuse to join the war and others have teamed up with the French. When Tenackerson announces he's leaving, George reminds him that his killing Joseph started this, but Tenackerson doesn't care. He hopes that the French and British will kill each other so the natives can reclaim their land. Then Christopher tells George that the ditch isn't working and they don't have enough rations left. He wants George to admit he chose the wrong spot and move the camp to save lives, but George refuses. In the morning, the militia is still dealing with the water in the ditch. James tells George he's an awful leader and challenges his authority, only to be suddenly shot in the back. It turns out the French are hiding in the trees and keep shooting at the fort, killing man after man. George immediately orders his men to fight back, but the French are firing from all sides so there's no safe spot to stand. While militia members keep dropping dead, George asks Christopher to divide the troops. He's determined to put up a fight, however the French bring out their cannons and start killing them even faster. George has no choice but to order everyone to retreat into the fort. As the militia starts to run, the tribes that teamed up with the French rush ahead to kill more men up close, taking advantage of the flooded ditch. When most of the militia is inside the fort, they have to close the doors and end up leaving a few men outside. To make things worse it starts to rain, so the powder is too wet to be fired. The crowd asks George to admit they've lost, yet he orders them to keep fighting. The fort walls aren't exactly thick so the enemy shots go through them and keep killing men, including Christopher. George rushes to his dying friend's side and notices all the death happening around him, so he finally allows a soldier to raise the white flag to surrender. That night, the fort is burned down. The French send a message offering a deal for mutual withdrawal. They'll take the militia's artillery and George must take responsibility for Joseph's death. A British soldier offers himself as security, so George signs the deal. While his men leave, he digs a grave for Christopher and apologizes. Later Robert yells at George for starting a war. George admits he's not fit to lead and resigns his commission. Afterward, George returns home and learns that Lawrence is dead, so he angrily uses an axe to hit a tree in a car, yelling in brief. Mary tells him that Lawrence wanted him to have his journals and that what happened isn't his fault. She understands now that she was too hard on him and that's why he's too hard on himself. Mary tells him that failure is God's tutor and learning from it grants wisdom. When George wonders if he should return to war, Mary encourages him to do so. That night, George reads Lawrence's journals and finds a note for him. His brother admitted he was wrong and that George was right. The world could be changed. In 1755, George meets General Edward and finds Gage working with him. George volunteers to be Edward's personal assistant, but Edward thinks it's not necessary because he has much more power than a militia, so the French should be a joke for his army. George immediately shows his knowledge of the area to prove some of Edward's information wrong and Gage supports him, so Edward agrees to bring George as an aide. A few days later, their trip is paused because the road is blocked by a tree. While waiting for the team to remove it, George discovers that some men from his old militia are here too and immediately begins helping them cut the tree. Gage disapproves of a military man being friends with such people, but they ignore him. George apologizes to his old team for what happened and even says he owes them a debt. That night, they set up camp and George is surprised to see slaves. It turns out they were sent by Thomas' family to fight in their stead. They also hear some music, and the team is frustrated to realize they've been moving extra weight because Edward has brought his piano. As the journey continues, George works hard helping the team move the carriages through mud and has to stay up late whenever Edward needs him to take notes. Eventually he's so weak that he passes out, and a nurse diagnoses him with dysentery. Instead of letting him rest, Gage wakes him up from his feverish state and tells him they're near the fort, so he shares his plan of attack. George doesn't think the plan is good and tells Gage to keep an eye on the trees, but he can't come along to advise him. Moments later, the troops are ambushed by the French just like George predicted. A battle ensues and at first Edward's army manages to fight back, but soon they're surrounded by the native tribes just like last time. Men begin to drop dead all over the place, not even those hiding among the trees are safe from French attack. The British army decides to regroup by the river, and even during their run they keep getting shot down. Eventually George wakes up in the carriage, taking the story back to the beginning. He ignores his dizziness and joins the fight, killing an enemy before getting a horse to ride to the hill. Gage informs him that his old friends are in the front lines and that Edward ordered a retreat, so attempting anything would equal death. George refuses to abandon his men and rides through the battlefield anyway, shooting French soldiers and dodging cannonballs as he goes. Eventually he reaches the team hiding in the woods and his horse is shot, so he's knocked out when he falls. At the same time, Edward gets shot too. When George wakes up, he runs to Edward's side and learns that Gage lied. There were no retreat orders. Edward wants him to rally the team and fall back. He also asks him to take his horse and save as many men as possible. Before dying, Edward gives George a sash. George immediately rides through the woods and tells his army that there's no retreat. They must hold their ground and form a rear guard. A line of defense hides among the trees and opens fire to successfully keep the French from advancing. Tucker tells George that their old team is still by the river, so George asks him to buy him some time for a rescue. At the river, only a few men are left and they have no power. One of the slaves is dead, so the other one decides to run away. Soon George arrives on Edward's horse and kills some French soldiers with his sword. When the enemy starts firing at it, he hangs on the saddle to hide behind the horse but ends up falling off. A soldier immediately comes after him. However, George knocks him down and steals his weapon. After killing a few men, George reaches his friends and tells them to fight. When they mention they don't have powder, the slave comes back with a keg full of it. They run to take cover behind a hill and open fire, successfully bringing down several French soldiers. Once enough enemies are down and there's an opening, George tells his friends to run to the right before he jumps into the battlefield, making himself a target. He quickly kills a few men, but when he's cornered by the natives, his weapon fails. The tribesmen open fire, yet only his hat gets shot. Then George gives the signal for Tucker to come out with the rest of the army, and they keep the French distracted so the group behind the hill can rush to safety. George keeps running through the battlefield as multiple explosions continue to go off around him. Moments later in the camp, Gage is shocked to see George return with the rest of the army. When George calls him out on his lie, Gage says the battle was lost and it was not worth dying for it. Gage's true land is Britain, but this is George's home. Afterward, Tanacharison introduces George to the leader of the tribe that helped the French. He explains that his men never miss, yet none of them managed to shoot George. His tribe has a legend about a spirit of protection that shields the chosen ones, so he believes that George has been shielded by the spirit and promises to remember his name. When George returns to the city, Robert calls him the man of the hour and reveals that his journals have been published in England, so now everyone knows what's happening in the colonies. Robert is forming a Virginia regiment of 1,500 men, the first of its kind in the colonies, and George is offered his colonel rank again to lead it. George agrees in exchange for a change of uniform. Later George meets with his troops and now everyone is wearing blue instead of red to proudly represent Virginia.